Welcome, everybody. This is a very beautiful day in Sweden, and I have people from all over the world here to meet. This wonderful poetry in translation process, purpose, and platforms was an idea that we was thinking about in Tranos when we had a festival of poetry, and a lot of poets, translations, editors, and friends of poetry were talking about this difficult task that is to translate. And I got the idea of La Libélula Vaga, Write for Word, Cultivera, and all the friends here to bring this topic here. For a conversation, I will have my friend Dominic Williams that will help me and introduce all the participants of the panel. And I am very happy to be here. I want to say thank you to all the viewers there, because I know they are there, and all the wonderful poets, publishers, translators, and most than anything, readers. So I am happy to be here. Dominic is all of you.
Thank you very much, Aleisa. Tack så mycket. Well, welcome to all the viewers, and I'd just like to briefly go around the room and let you know who these wonderful translators are that are here with us today. We have two Swedish men who are both translators and publishers, actually. Jonas Ellerström is a publisher and has translated himself some rather great names, among them T.S. Eliot, Arthur Rimbaud, Sylvia Plath, Margaret Atwood, William Blake, and he has produced several volumes. Bengt Berg, also a publisher, and has published himself. His own work has been translated into many languages: Arabian, Hebrew, English, German, Dutch, Greek, Spanish, Turkish, the list goes on. He lives very close to the Norwegian border, and in fact his first language is a dialect, which is neither Swedish nor Norwegian. Elizabeth Torres is a Colombian poet who runs the Red Door magazine, is the curator at the Red Door Gallery, runs a podcast series, also a translator, particularly into Spanish. Her work has been translated into English and into German. Maria has worked since 1983 at the United Nations, so has this perspective of both an interpreter, immediate interpretation, as well as literary translation. And Maria translates from English, French, Italian, and German. Clare Potter is a bilingual Welsh poet. Clare has translated the national poet of Wales, and Clare is a performer also, as well as a poet and a translator. She's won awards for her spoken word poetry, the John Tripp Award. She's been awarded 2 Literature Wales writing bursaries. And so we have a wonderful collection of languages and people. Those participants are just going to say a little bit now about some particular aspect that interests them about translation. So I'm going to hand it over to Bengt to start.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, to sit in the Swedish darkness and join you. As our beloved host Dominic said, my first language, my mother tongue, is dialect. And that means I have a special connection to oral language compared to written. And that's a very great difference for me. And for the people who are living around here in the neighborhood. I should say something about the connection between big city language and countryside language in translation terms. I imagine that a poem written in and depicting an urban environment can somehow be interpreted in and understood more easily than if the relationship were in a rural perspective, where the uniqueness and the specific living conditions also closely linked to older living conditions, traditions, local phenomena that may not exist outside the current cultural circle. The life of the countryside all over the world is very special, I think, and the lives and the culture in the big cities are rather similar. It doesn't matter if you are in Beijing, Berlin, Rio de Janeiro, or Dar es Salaam. There are so great similarities between the life there, I suppose. But we are who are living in the countryside are more isolated in different ways, but also very close to each other as neighbor. The neighbors are very few, but they are the more important for us. I myself write poems that can very well and relatively easily be transported to another language, while another category is far too firmly rooted in my own social and geographical environment, which make it difficult for the translator to find corresponding linguistic concepts in it. Oh, I'm tired already. This is the Google translation. There was no translating into dialect.
Thank you, Bengt. It's interesting that your conversation as you're speaking now is some sort of interpretation and translation. I guess we should pass the gauntlet over to Clare now.
Yeah, it's fine.
Oh, hi. Good evening. I was born as an English speaker, but I learned Welsh in school, and it's many years ago since I've had any formal education. So my grammar and the way I speak Welsh is informed by when I meet people. So much like you, Bengt, it's kind of like I'm taught through the oral exchange rather than I don't really read a great deal in Welsh. And so for me, I've translated from Welsh into English because I felt confident to do that, because English is my language and I could work with Welsh, and you can use dictionaries, you can talk to first language Welsh speakers, and then I could kind of craft what I knew the meaning was to create this new piece of art, but which kind of represented the original. But through Dominic last year, it was the first time I ever translated from English to Welsh. And that was such an exciting experience. I was nervous, and I said, I'll only do it if when you see it, we might decide it needs to go to somebody who knows Welsh better than me. But as it transpired, it turned into quite an interesting exchange. And I don't know, do I have time to share a bit of that now, or should I wait till later, Dominic?
I think that'd be fine to share a little bit now, Clare. Yeah.
So just very briefly, I think I've been in situations where events where there's a translator, and I think you have to be as accurate as you can to what a speaker is saying. But I believe when you're translating a piece of work that you're in service to the intention and the meaning, not so much the exact language. And with your poem, Dominic, about a man coming out of water, you had this lovely, these 3 lines: at dawn he skinny dipped in the icy Towie, and now basks on her naked belly, calm, full of charm and confidence. I mean, the sounds that are glorious. But in Welsh, I don't know, I wanted to bring something of the water coming with this man coming out of the water. And so I said, rather than full of charm, I said llawn ffydd, llawn hyder o'r awel y dŵr, so that he was bringing kind of the breeze of the water with him. And because the sounds were more melodic, And then I was thinking of the Welsh form of Cynghanedd and how there are sounds kind of harmonizing. And I wanted to, because of the harmony that was displayed in your English version, I wanted to translate the sound as much as the actual images. So that was of interest to me. And then, because it's so funny, I was looking at this poem yesterday and I noticed a mistake I'd made. I think it was Robert Frost who said, poetry is what gets lost in translation. And Dominic, you and I were talking about what gets found in translation. And I'd accidentally said, plymio ven doith. He plunges into the water. I was supposed to put naked, which is noith, and I'd accidentally put doith. And doith is wisely. And it was only yesterday I realized I'd made that mistake. And I was like, oh my gosh, Dominic, I made that. And I was like, actually, I quite like the fact that he's dived in, because of the rest of what your poem was trying to show. That fit perfectly. So it's like the poem was like trying to translate itself beyond me.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Yes, I forgive you. I never expected to be imbued with any wisdom, so it's nice to have that in Welsh. Again, I'm going to pass over to Ellie now and ask her to give us a little bit of an introduction to her translation process.
Well, thank you. I think that it's a very tricky thing to sit in a virtual room and talk about translation, not being an academic, because it's kind of intimidating. Like, why on earth do I have anything to say that is valuable to this conversation? But my process comes very organically from being a poet who needed translation in order to continue the work as a poet. And having grown in both the United States and in Colombia gave me a love to two very different languages and taught me to play between them when I was writing. So I could write in Spanish and have a completely different voice to what I had in English. And then people started doing translations of my own work. And I was reading them as I was learning English and realizing, oh, if ever I want to be content with this, I need to be able to translate it myself. But the first thing that I had to do was then actually study both languages professionally, because even though I did grow up and was fluent in them, I think that a language is something that provides many tools if only we eat enough of it and frequently update our vocabulary. And as a translator now, which is a fantastic thing to say, that I can also provide that service to other poets, renowned poets in Colombia and in Latin America, but also American poets wanting to enter the Latin American readers. Well, I've realized that there are several misconceptions and several mistakes that we can make and that are quite common. And I accepted being part of this conversation to maybe mention them, because maybe we'll relate to them and we'll find them funny. Maybe we're still making them, and our exchanges today will help us improve them. But I've noticed that a thing that is happening a lot with contemporary works has to do with reinterpreting or saying, being kind of quoted in the covers of books as poetry reinterpreted by this person. And although I definitely respect that poetry needs to not just be translated literally, but also when it comes to the essence of the poem, it needs to be translated in regards to emotions. It cannot be rewritten so that it becomes a new version of a poem. And I think that a lot of people do that because they either don't have the absolute fluency of the language or the interest or the time. And this leads to the next mistake that we do, and that is not getting, proofread and not getting edited and not asking others to give us a hand, assuming that what we did was enough, because it's not just one word or one letter that we tend to forget. Sometimes it can be entire paragraphs that we skip, and a line in a poem is an arm or a leg. And then there's another one that kind of makes me laugh a lot at festivals and when I travel around. And that's like the translator trying to become the star when the author is still alive and almost assuming full copyright without having it. In many cases, actually committing copyright infringement, because yes, of course, you are a translator and you're opening an entire world of another language to the author, but you're still not the author. So I think that credit should always be due and, you know, foremost to the author. Google is not our friend. I think it's something that we should always keep in mind. Automated translation still cannot replace an actual poet, an actual translator. So if we don't have the tools like the language or the literacy abilities, then we should always ask a friend. I have found that virtually groups like the Literary Translators group on Facebook is an excellent tool, because I can always go there and there's very prepared academic and poetry translators and all sorts of other types of books. And you ask a question and from all over the world, they give you feedback. And that has been an excellent source for me. And because I have the English to Spanish combination, the American Translators Association has been a delightful choice for me to join. So I think it's always a question of self-actualization and reaching out to our network as we're doing right now, and being able to say that we're not, you know, the perfect and final and unique translation, because there's so many possibilities.
Eli, I wanted to say to you and Jonas, because this is one of the things that are always in my mind, that when you can ask to the author, because if you have a relation to the author, you are a friend, or if the author is alive, you can ask. But if the author is dead, you can't ask, and you must take decisions, or you must search for answer. So sometimes, I know. Sometimes they saying wrong. People are almost violating the text. You know, they are not loyal to the author because the author is not alive. And this question is interesting because of the old traditions, new traditions, the new readers, the old readers.
My translator from Spanish to Danish, Malene, she helped me to create a compilation for publishing in Poetiske Bureau, my first book published in Danish. And she celebrated that I was alive when we met. And I said, why on earth are you so happy that I'm alive? And she said, well, I was translating Gabriela Mistral before. So it's nice that you and I can sit and have a coffee together. Of course, if there's no chance of doing that, then I guess we run it once again towards our network and ask for other essays about it. And the key, I think, is finding in translation the combination of communicative translation and semantic, so the form and the message, because these two can never be separated when it has to do with poetry translation. Synes jeg.
Thank you, Ellie. Yeah, some wonderful advice. I mean, particularly that going to a community, of course, which we're experiencing today, and yeah, among the common errors, also beautiful lines of poetry yourself. I love that line, that a line of poetry is an arm or a leg. It was yeah, fantastic. Jonas, would you like to address us all now?
I will. And looking at my own background, anyone seeing my CV or something like that would say, well, this man he's a Swedish speaker, he's a monolingual creature. On the other hand, if we look at it more closely, we'll find that much like Bengt, much like Clare, I am shaped by the kind of Swedish that I speak, which Elizabeth, living in Copenhagen right now, will know as a southern Swedish dialect, as Scanian, which is quite close to Danish, the landscape where I grew up, being a part of Denmark up until the mid 17th century. So I'd say I'm bilingual in that I speak my dialect, or it's a question of sound. It's a question of the feel of the vowels and the consonants. There are not very many words that are different or have a different meaning, but I have a sound at my disposal which is different from the ordinary Swedish, the Swedish traditionally spoken by radio and TV announcers, which is meant to be a neutral Swedish. Also, growing up on the outskirts of Sweden, in its very southern part, quite close to Denmark, quite close to Germany, it has maybe helped in making me always reach out for other languages, reach out for other literary traditions, to try and establish links, not just across borders, but also not just across space, but also across time. More and more, I think of translation, which makes up quite a large deal of my working day or my working time, as this has been said before, of course, the ultimate close reading of a text is to translate it. And therein might lie some of the danger that Elizabeth points out, that you enter into the text so fully, you enter into the semantic, but also the sonic qualities of the poems, that you can be tempted to take it over, to infringe copyright, more or less. But also I'm thinking that the work of a translator is the most humble and dedicated work you can possibly find within literature. I used to say, well, last few years I've met very many, very, very pleasant and very nice people among authors. I used to think that translators were easier to get along with. I used to like translators better because they were less full of themselves, because they looked upon language and working with language as handicraft, as something that took acquired skills to do. And authors tended to rely on genius, on inspiration, on alcohol, on whatever. And no matter the quality of that text, I sometimes found it hard to break through that shell of ego that are built up around themselves. This is not for bashing authors. There are many authors that I like, but also very many translators, because of, I find more often that those are the ones that really listen to, get under the skin of a text and try to understand it, but also, which is the second very important step, to transfer the text into another language to new readers. And that's why I think of translating as the ultimate form of literary communication as well, across national and linguistic borders, but also across time. I know that there are ever so many translators that prefer to work with living authors, and I don't mind that, not at all. It can be very rewarding. It's given me some of the friendships of my life. But on the other hand, I can immensely enjoy working with a 19th century text. I've translated some Baudelaire recently, some of his prose, that is. And there are no shortcuts then. There is no author to mislead me. It's just me, the text, the dictionaries, all the help I can get from gifted friends. And what I feel that I'm able to do in working with an older text is to bring it up to date, which does not mean to interpret it, to polish it into contemporary language, but actually, like somebody finding a treasure, lifting it out of the ground, cleaning it and saying, here it is, it's for you. This is relevant, it speaks to us now. So I still keep on dividing my time between translating living authors and dead, sometimes very dead ones. Okay, that's about it for now.
Yes, I worry about the very dead ones. And it makes me even more concerned about the ones who might only partially be alive. Maria, would you like to tell us a little bit about your experience?
Sure. Well, you suggested, Dominic, that I speak a little bit about my experience as a UN translator. And I've worked there for over 35 years as a documentary translator, as a translator, not an interpreter, but a translator of written texts. And this experience has really helped me a great deal in my literary and poetry translation. The learning I had there as to, first of all, respecting the accuracy and completeness of the text of the original, even though we're talking about prose now, we're not talking about poetry. The clarity and a neutral style, a lean style, with using the best prose tradition of the target language, that is in this case Spanish, because I would translate from English and French into Spanish. So these things have helped me a lot in my literary and especially poetry translation. Also, it taught me to do research, vocabulary, references, sources, and this in the case of literary translation of an 19th century or not living author, as Jonas was referring to, is very important. And for example, in my translations of Baudelaire, I have had to do a lot of research into the historical context, the social context of the time, the linguistic uses of certain words. So all of this research is apprenticeship somehow, and to know what sources to look for to help me in the translation of poetry have been extremely important. I owe all of this to my prose translation experience in the UN. Also, not taking anything for granted, including one's own certainties about grammar, spelling, or whatever. Yeah, you always have to doubt and verify. And this is so important in poetry translation. You know, sometimes you know the author, you know some of his poems or her poems by heart, and they sound fantastic to you, and you know you feel you practically own these verses. But when you translate, you have to look deeper into all of this, as both Jonas and Elizabeth were saying. You really have to, you know, do a kind of operation on the poem and look inside at all the organs and all its parts. And therefore, you have to use all of these resources in order to translate literature also, especially poetry. I believe prose translation, documentary translation is a kind of a handicraft work, as Jonas was saying, whereas literary and especially poetry translation, I consider an art, a real art, and the aim being to produce a poem in its own right, but not your poem, not one's poem. It's the other's poem, yeah? It's the poet's poem, and you have to respect that. And we're not talking, of course, of literal translation, but you have to respect not only the context, the tone, the type of images. You cannot just turn this into your own creation, because that's not the purpose of translation, in my view. So in my experience, I've translated some Austrian poets, some living Austrian poets. For example, one of them, Marie-Thérèse Kirschbaumer, I translated her elegies. These are elegies in the style of Rilke. Okay, these are philosophical elegies in high German, very high German, with a lot of very complex poems, long poems, with a lot of hidden references, like images from her personal readings, her personal experiences, which are not necessarily clearly identified. So you need, in this case, to talk with the author luckily it's a living author, so this is one of the advantages, and clarify all of these things. You learn a lot in this process, not only translation-wise, but also learn to know the poet himself or herself, and you really learn to look into, to delve into a lot of ideas and philosophical or poetic theories that this person might have been familiar with or developing or applying. In her case, there was a lot of rhetorical resources like ellipsis, metaphor, metonymy. So all of these things made it a very difficult translation, and the help of the poet was extremely important. And another poet, Austrian poet that I translated is Gerhart Koffler. Now, the totally different experience there, because he's a bilingual poet from the Südtirol, German and Italian. So he would translate his own poems that he wrote initially in German, he would translate them into Italian and vice versa. So you had to deal with sometimes differences, nuances in coming from his own, because he is the owner of the poem. So he was, entitled to do whatever he wanted. Not that these differences were very great, but they were nuances. They were little, differences that when you want to translate all of that into Spanish, then you have to, deal with the German, deal with the Italian, and find a middle ground. Also, his German was city, urbane, high German from the university, from the cities, but his Italian was, as Bengt was saying, a more local, familial language from his grandparents that he learned from his grandparents and so on. So that there again, a lot of colloquial expressions that are not necessarily used in standard Italian had to be also consulted with the poet. Luckily, he's no longer alive, but when I was working with him, he was able to clarify these things for me. Very interesting. So, and I know this confrontation with self-translation, I have had that experience myself, because I have translated my own poems into English. And sometimes I find myself, wanting to say things in English in a certain way that is not exactly the same way I said them in Spanish, because I like the English expression better, or this type of thing. So it would present a problem for somebody translating that into another language. Sometimes, I don't do it too often, but sometimes. Anyway, I've translated some other poems, Austrian poets that have, but not books, not entire books like these two that I mentioned. I have translated some contemporary Italian poets recently. They use a lot of ellipses somehow, and it's difficult to translate it. They are poems that look simple, but they are not really, because of the elliptical mode in which they seem to work, and it's also important to consult with them. And then there's Baudelaire, which is a lifelong task of mine. I've been doing this for many, many years. I'm luckily almost finished with Les Fleurs du Mal, which was my objective. And then that's a totally different ball game. And maybe we can speak about that a little bit later. And I would like to maybe read a sonnet in both languages, so that you can see my attempt to recreate the rhyme, the meter, and the sound of Baudelaire.
Thank you, Maria. I love the comparison of your documentary translation, your poetic translation, as a handicraft and an art. And it's great that there are so many things that people are relating to each other, and it's we're not physically in the room together, but I can see lots of nodding heads, lots of agreements, lots of smiles. So I just wonder if anybody wants to pick up on anybody else's themes as we go. Claire.
I just wanted to say that sometimes I speak with a dead poet. Most of the time I speak with him or her.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I really I agree with Maria about, you used the term apprenticeship, and I'm so indebted to the National Poet of Wales, Ifor ap Glyn, because he knew that my Welsh was of a good level, but not of a very good level. And so by asking me to translate his work into English, it was a process of negotiation, because I had to be very, obviously I wanted to make sure he was happy. And so it was, you know, back and forth. And it was, I ended up learning more Welsh and actually more about English through doing that. And recently then, because Dominic's was the first poem I translated into Welsh, but when I had my first commission recently, I asked to have a peer, so that then somebody who had much better Welsh than me could check it, and then they sent it back to me, and then I learned more Welsh through that. And I think if ever I were to do more of that, I would always want to have a peer to check against my idea of what the translation should look like.
I would have something to add on the subject of working with the poet. Most of the time, I mean, it's brilliant. You get to know people, you know, it's a social dimension to it. But just to put things in the balance, also I've translated Danish poet and Norwegian poets, also American poets who know Swedish, and there is a certain difficulty in being the translator of their work and going through the translation with them. I've found that very, very sensitive and very sensible authors can sometimes, they can't bear to see their poems change. They want them to look just like the original, even in another language. And this goes down into the very detail. You use commas in quite a different way in Danish and in Swedish. The other languages are otherwise closely related. And I would have Danish poet number 1, number 2, etc., saying, "Oh, can't we have comma there?" And I said, "We don't use commas in those instances in Sweden. Can't we have it anyway?" So there is something to be said for the authority of the translator over the author, and but I would agree, of course, that always the translator has a lot to learn from the author. There are certain personal things, there are certain meanings, etc., that needs clarification. On the other hand, the translation has got to be in its final shape. It has to be voiced through the translator. This has nothing to do with copyright or making the poem your own, but the poem has to be reinvented in this new language. And that's why the translator, that's why the art of poetry translation is an art. You need to add your own voice to this. That means you have to make your own voice work with, like a choir. You need to learn how to sing with this other poet's voice.
Bengt, you wanted to make a comment, I think.
Yes, I asked myself, when translating a poem, who are you most loyal to? The poem itself or the poet who wrote it? And I think it's not quite simple to answer the question. And the poem, the origin poem can give the translator an impulse, a jerk in another direction, a little direction, but a direction. And if I must make up my mind to whom the loyalty will be, for me it's to the poem. For example, if I have one of my poems translated into some language that I don't know, I have no idea about how it goes, but for me it's most important that the poem will seem rather natural in the new context, in the new audience or what you call it. And I think that a translated poem is in some way a new poem. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to refer to what Jonas said about the voice of the translator really being coherently in showing through the translation, and I agree with that. And you can see that very clearly when you see the different translations of the same poem by different translators. Each one has a totally different, personality, so to speak. It's the same poem, the same basic poem that is being translated, but so many different versions where the translator's voice in different ways, more closer to the original or not, but shines through in a very definite way.
I want to add to what Bengt said, because I've noticed that sometimes in poetry we narrate very specific locations based on the place we live or our current time and space. And when you're translating for a completely different audience, language, country, continent, the name of the pub and the name of the street and the name of the people will make zero sense. The pronunciation, for example, will be complicated and will cut the actual rhythm of the poem. So I've noticed that sometimes it's actually necessary. If you are producing a collection of poetry in translation for a specific audience, you also have to think of them and making sure that it makes sense to them, so that by transforming certain aspects of that poem, you in reality reflect or mirror what the poet was saying. Does
right.
that?
I think we could try the sound. Dominic, will I be allowed to read a short poem of mine in Swedish and afterwards in a German translation?
Absolutely.
Because that was I have done no translation of my own things, and I'm thinking that if I translate others, too few of them should try and translate me, and I need to subject myself to that. This is. It doesn't matter if you don't understand Swedish. This is a chess poem. It's about the piece that is on both the flanks. It's known as a rook in English. The Swedish name would be a tower. It's a powerful piece, but it is shaped like the corner tower of a fortress. This is how it sounds in Swedish. Tornet. Inga människor syns i gluggarna. Fästningen är tyst och sluten, men dess dolda ögon ser dig. Den hör vart ord som yttras utanför dess murar. En dag har han sett och hört tillräckligt. Då sätter den sig i rörelse. This suite of poems was translated into German by Lukas Detwiler, who is a good translator. And looking through his translations as a preparation for this program, I noticed that I immediately liked his translations of the two Rook poems. There is one poem for each piece, naturally two Rook poems. And I think that is because I think that the sounds of the German sounds fit the quality of the chess piece so very well. This might be a misguided preconception of mine, but I'm thinking of German as a strict language, as slightly harsh sometimes, not in Rilke though. But this is the way Lukas' translation of the poem sounds. Der Turm. Nicht ein Mensch ist zu sehen in den Gucklöchern. Die Burg ist stumm und verriegelt. Durch ihre heimlichen Augen sehen dich und hört jedes Wort, das außerhalb ihrer Mauern fällt. Eines Tages hat sie genug gesehen und gehört. Dann setzt sie sich in Bewegung. And I love that translation because of the sounds, and I love seeing there are vast differences between German syntax and Swedish syntax and grammar. But I feel so happy to see the poem in its new shape, and also, but most of all, I love the new sounds that Lucas has brought to this chess piece.
Thank you, Jonas. It was, yeah, wonderful listening to the different sounds, and it was you, I think, who mentioned the sonic translation earlier on. Maria, I know you were hoping to give us a little bit of an example also. Perhaps now seems the right time for you to do that. You're muted, Maria.
Okay, yes. I think the sound is very important also, especially when I talked about Baudelaire before. I think here it's absolutely, necessary to try to maintain the musicality of the poem. So I'd like to read you also a sonnet in French and then in Spanish. Let's see. Parfum exotique. Can you hear me well? Quand les deux yeux fermés, en un soir chaud d'automne, je respire l'odeur de ton sang chaleureux, je vois se dérouler des rivages heureux, qu'éblouissent les feux d'un soleil monotone. Une île paresseuse où la nature donne des arbres singuliers et des fruits savoureux, des hommes dont le corps est mince et vigoureux, et des femmes dont l'œil par sa franchise étonne. Guidé par ton odeur vers de charmants climats, je vois un port rempli de voiles d'émais, encore tout fatigué par la vague marine. Pendant que le parfum des verts tamariniers, qui circulent dans l'air et m'enfle la narine, se mêle dans mon âme au chant des mariniers. That's the French. So the Spanish would be perfume exótico. Cuando en tarde otoñal con los ojos cerrados respiro el perfume de tu cálido seno, contemplo el litoral de perfiles amenos al rayo de un monótono sol encandilado. Una isla perezosa que la naturaleza alfombra de árboles singulares y de sabrosos frutos. Hombres de cuerpo recio y músculos enjutos, mujeres de mirada cuya franqueza asombra. Guiado por tu olor hacia encantados climas, veo un puerto en que velas y mástiles se arriman, todavía extenuados por la ola marinera. En tanto que el perfume de verdes tamarindos, que circula en el aire y al que mi olfato rindo, con cantos de marinos en mi alma se entrevera.
Congratulations. that sounded really good.
Thank you. So the rhyme is kept with the same rhyme structure that Baudelaire used. This is not necessarily always the case because for the sake of retaining the rhyme, one may alter the rhyme structure. Instead of ABBA, you can have ABAB if you must. I think I would prioritize in that case keeping the rhyme than keeping the structure. But in any case here, the rhyme structure has been kept. And the meter, these are 12 syllable poems in French. The French Alexandrin is 12 syllables. The Spanish Alexandrin, because of the structure of the language itself, is 14 syllables. Yeah, because of the sonic structure of the French, because of the mute E at the end of many words, tends to have the tonic accent sounds like the end of the syllable, even though there's a mute E afterwards, but which is doesn't really count in the meter. In Spanish, you don't have that. So you have 2 more syllables. So here is it's translated into the Spanish Alexandrin, which is 14 syllables. So that has always also been kept. And I think the musicality, at the same time that is respected the semantic content, adds to the, you know, to a good translation. And this is what I aim. I read this poem because I think that in this particular poem, I achieved that. In other poems, it may be a lot more difficult, and one may have to have recourse to assonant rhyme and not consonant rhyme. But still, that is a, you know, it is a resource that is poetically viable and sound. But I try to achieve the consonant rhyme, and it's not always easy. So that was the example I wanted to read for you.
Thank you, Maria. It's really interesting that at the outset of this conversation, and for all of this conversation, really, we've been talking about translation of the written word. That's it, in essence, what we're talking about. And yet, everybody's example and many of people's comments go back to the oral. Bengt started at the very beginning, and we talk about musicality, we talk about the sonic construction. That's really interesting, isn't it?
I think you're right there, Dominic. I was hearing some Swedish Baudelaire translations in the back of my head as Maria read and commented on the technique of her translation. And in Swedish, there is no, there are no Alexandrins. We count stressed syllables and against non-stressed syllables. So I was thinking that however good a Swedish Baudelaire sonnet translation is, it's difficult to avoid the lines do not flow in the ways that they did in French and in Spanish just now. They tend to be, they seem a little bit more repetitive. There's a same kind of melody that will enter into the different lines. And no fault in that, but it's a slightly different kind of musicality. It's slightly more predictable, if you want.
Yeah, I have thought of that. The fact that the translation, my translation, is into Spanish, which is a relatively, you know, similar language to French, because they're both Romance languages from Latin, and the same thing I think would happen in Italian. You are probably more able to maintain a more similar musicality and more similar sonic structure to the original than in Germanic or other languages that are very far from that kind of structure.
But I think that's here we touch upon something that I think we all agree on, that the literal translation is in so many cases, however much we study, however gifted friends we have, that's an impossible achievement. So we replace things, but you can make good replacements and you can make really awful replacements.
Right.
Bengt.
Bengt, you have a lot of book there, so read something.
Yeah. I have a short-liner, two-liners poem. It goes like this. A forest with one single tree, it stands in the middle. And for me, it's just a perhaps comical poem about nature, but I read it in Babylon in Iraq. And I get a lot of questions about what do I mean? And that they have a very religious, some of them have had a very religious interpretation of it. A forest with one single tree. So even the very simple and few words can give a lot of meanings for the people in different circumstances.
I've always imagined, Bengt, that single tree in the forest is actually on the edge, on the margins. Ellie, you wanted to make a comment, I think.
Not that I can recall. I guess that
You're probably just asking Anders for another glass of wine.
No, no, that I definitely agree that the musicality of the poem can definitely change between languages. And of course, it's nothing when we have the Romance languages, we share that musicality that can be in common, maybe not by form, but sounds are similar. When you hear the translations of my poems to German, the book that came out this year, or the one to Danish, it's like, yeah, I'm sure that's a friendly tone too. I hope they mean it well. But of course, once you compare the poems, you understand it's all there. Or once you get used to the other sounds that are not of Romance languages, it's a total skill, I assume, kind of like being a musician as well.
There are some very musical translations of Baudelaire into English. I forget, I don't have the name of the translator here now, but with rhyme also. So sometimes it is possible, but of course, depending on the language and the translator, that can vary a lot. But getting back to something Elizabeth said before, references to places, to local things, to wines, to also historical or mythological references, which there are a lot of in Baudelaire. This presents problems. You have to, somehow get that in there, but also, especially in Baudelaire, in certain poems like Le Cygne, the Swan, which is a poem about Paris. Paris was changed drastically during Baudelaire's lifetime. During the entire 19th century, the whole, the walls, the medieval walls were taken down, the city was expanded. Then came the Baron Haussmann, this architect that planned the whole city. All of this was happening in Baudelaire's time, and he refers to some of these things, places. As I was crossing the Nouveau Carrousel, you have to make this understandable somehow for the reader, for the today's reader who is not may not know Paris, and certainly doesn't know what Baudelaire is talking about when he says the Nouveau Carrousel. This is a whole Place du Carrousel with the arc of the Carrousel, which was in the middle of a very urban area, which was totally raised to open up the space and make these perspectives, these incredible perspectives from the Louvre to the Arc de Triomphe, and this thing was in the middle. So you have to know this. You have to research this, first of all, if you don't know it. You have to research when you read Baudelaire and know what he's talking about in order to be able to translate this in a coherent way for the person who is reading it today.
Or follow the translation with a bunch of footnotes.
Yeah,
but that's
right.
not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing at all, is it?
Jonas, please.
That's for academic translations of a poet, for people who want to, there are, volumes of Baudelaire like that, full of footnotes, but not what I would like.
Jonas, could you make your point, please?
Yes, but I don't think that's need at all be academic. I love the way translations that require some kind of commentary, some kind of introduction from me. It brings out the essayist, and I love to cram information, never disturbing the poem, of course, adding on to it, and also it's adding also in the introduction or the postscript and the commentary, it's adding my own voice. It's a way of describing my own work. And I think we could do that with translation for Baudelaire. I think that could also solve the problem that Bengt pointed out in the very beginning, how to sort of to make rural poems accessible to people living in urban areas, etc. I love the idea of the meta text to a translation, and I did say definitely needn't be academic at all.
I agree with you, but what I
interrupt everybody and say, we are coming to the end of our program.
Dominic, can I just say something super quick? No, I totally agree with you, Jonas, but I don't, I would put all those footnotes at the end somehow. What I don't like are these poems full of little numbers and footnotes at the very end. Absolutely, I agree. I agree. That is so enriching. Absolutely needed.
This is the point which I really hoped we would arrive. I never wanted to conclude this conversation, to find an end point. Things are happening, people are talking to each other. This is a wonderful place to be, and I know that this conversation can continue. I know you guys want to carry on talking to each other. The viewers, I'm sure, want to hear more. So I really hope that we can pull these people together again to continue this conversation in another episode in early 2021. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to Aleisa, because we have to say thank you to Lalabulula Vaga for being the host of so Aleisa, please can you say some closing?
I want to say that I was delighted here for one of the most interesting topics to me. And I will call this fishing words, because it's only fishing the right word. And sometimes the word, there is no word. Sometimes, like saudade. I'm feeling saudade for this. Saudade is a Portuguese word that is mean not exactly lengtan. Lengtan is one of the most beautiful words. Nostalgia. I'm feeling already the need, the sug urungen. What is the name of this word?
The word in Welsh is hero.
Unruhe. Unruhe.
To play again with you as well. Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you, Aleisa. Thank you, Dominic. Nice being with all of you.
Lentar.
Hope to see you soon again.
Been a
We will.
pleasure.
Bye.
Been a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.